My name is Suzanne, and I'm 28. I got laid off on a Tuesday. Clean, corporate, the kind of meeting where they thank you for your contributions and slide a severance packet across the table like it's supposed to soften the fall. I went home and did the responsible things first. Checked my bank app, updated my resume, told myself I'd land on my feet. 2 days later, my landlord reached out and said he needed to talk. I assumed it was about the apartment, maybe the repairs he'd been putting off. Instead, he told me someone had contacted him directly and offered $500 extra to end my lease early. Not next month, not at the end of the term. Early, fast, and with a deadline that made my stomach drop. It wasn't a stranger, it wasn't a mistake. It was my sister. When I called her, she didn't sound shocked or guilty. She sounded entertained, like this was a story she couldn't wait to repeat at dinner. The message was simple. This was for my own good, and if I didn't like it, I should figure it out. The worst part wasn't the money. It was realizing how quickly my life could be rearranged by people who claimed they loved me, and how calm they were while doing it. By the next afternoon, the situation got even uglier, even faster. Paperwork moved, timelines tightened, and I realized I had less leverage than I thought. So I stopped arguing. I stopped pleading. I said nothing, hung up, and made one call. And almost immediately, everything changed. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. By Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed again while I was staring at my resume like it had personally betrayed me. It was my landlord asking if I had a minute to talk. I stepped out onto the little balcony outside my unit because I didn't want the neighbor in 3B hearing my life come apart through the walls. His voice had that careful tone people use when they've already decided what they're going to do. He told me someone had reached out to him directly and offered $500 to end my lease early and have me out fast. He didn't say who at first. When I asked, he admitted it was my sister, then followed it with an apology that sounded practiced. I asked him if he could even do that. My original lease term had ended months ago, and it had rolled into month to month. Normally, that meant notice and time. He agreed, then said he wasn't trying to file an official eviction. He was offering an early termination agreement. If I signed it, I would have 48 hours. He said he'd waive the next rent payment and be fair about my deposit, but he didn't promise anything in writing on that call. I stood there with my hands on the railing, trying not to let my voice shake. I had just lost my paycheck. I didn't have a new one lined up. I didn't have enough cash to put down first month, last month, and a deposit somewhere else on short notice. And now my sister had paid extra money to speed up the worst week of my adult life. I asked him why he was entertaining it. He didn't pretend it was about principle. He said turnover was expensive, but a vacancy would let him reset the rent, and the $500 made the inconvenience worth it. He repeated that he felt weird about it, which was his way of staying comfortable while still taking the money. When we hung up, I didn't go back inside right away. I stayed outside until the air made my skin sting, because moving felt like admitting it was real. Then I called my sister. I didn't open with a speech. I asked one question. Did you pay him to do this? She didn't deny it. She didn't sound guilty either. She talked like she was doing me a favor, like this was a push I needed. She kept it light, almost amused, as if my housing situation was a storyline she could control. The message underneath her tone was simple. This was happening, and I was supposed to take it. I ended the call before I said something that would get used against me later. After that, I called my parents. I wasn't asking them to fix my life. I wasn't even asking for money. I asked if I could stay with them temporarily while I figured out work and housing, because I did not have a backup plan that fit into 2 days. They said no. Not after thinking it over. Not after asking questions. Just no. Delivered calmly. like it was a boundary they were proud of. My dad framed it as a lesson. My mom framed it as motivation. They used the kind of language that makes cruelty sound responsible. They kept saying love while refusing basic shelter. When I ended that call, something in me went quiet. I stopped expecting a sudden reversal, stopped waiting for someone to remember they cared. That evening, I walked my apartment like it was a checklist. I opened closets. I counted boxes I didn't own. I made 3 piles on the floor: essentials, replaceable, and impossible. I checked the trunk of my car and realized it wasn't a solution. It was just a container. I tried one more option before midnight. I texted a friend I hadn't spoken to in a while, someone who once said I could crash if I ever needed it. The message was read. No reply. I stared at the screen until my eyes hurt, then set the phone down and told myself I wouldn't beg twice in one day. Near 1 in the morning, my landlord sent a follow-up text asking for my answer by the next afternoon so he could plan accordingly. It wasn't a threat on paper, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of message that reminds you who has the keys. I set my phone face down on the counter and started packing a bag, not because I agreed with what was happening, but because I finally understood the reality of my position. People who were supposed to have my back were coordinating my collapse, and I was the only one left to decide what came next. The next morning, I drove back to my building with an empty trunk and a tight feeling in my throat. I told myself I'd keep it practical, get in, pack what mattered, and leave without making it a scene. The parking lot looked normal from the street, the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. But the moment I stepped into the hallway, I knew I was already late to my own life. My key didn't work. I tried it twice, then once more slower, like that would change the outcome. The lock had been replaced. I stood there for a second, staring at the doorknob like it was a stranger's. My name was still on the mailbox. The door just wasn't mine anymore. I looked down the corridor and saw the piles before I reached them. Cardboard boxes, trash bags, a laundry basket I recognized, a shoe rack I'd bought online because it was cheap and good enough. Everything I owned was stacked along the wall as if it had been sorted by someone who didn't care whether it stayed clean, dry, or intact. A couple of neighbors walked by and didn't make eye contact. I couldn't blame them. In their place, I would have done the same. There's a specific kind of humiliation in seeing your life reduced to whatever fits in a box, especially when you didn't get to decide the timing. I crouched and started checking what was there. Some of it was intact. Some of it was not. A glass frame had cracked. One trash bag had torn open, and a spill of clothes and bathroom stuff had smeared across the floor. I gathered it back up with shaking hands, not because it was precious, but because leaving anything behind felt like admitting I wasn't coming back. I called my landlord and asked him why he had changed the locks before I had even cleared out. He didn't argue with me. He gave a calm explanation about liability, about not wanting me to come and go while he was preparing for a turnover. He said my things were accessible, so I wasn't being denied access. The words were tidy. The reality wasn't. I stopped talking before I sounded desperate. Packing became triage. I grabbed documents first, then my laptop, then the small things that become emergencies when you don't have a home. Medications, chargers, the one jacket that actually keeps you warm. I loaded what I could carry into the car and kept going back for more, trying to ignore how exposed I felt each time I walked down that hallway. At some point, I realized I was making decisions based on weight instead of value. I held a box of books for a second, then put it back down because it was too heavy and I didn't have the space or the strength. I told myself I'd replace them later, even though part of me knew that was a lie. People tell themselves to stay calm. When the trunk was nearly full, I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel until my vision blurred. I wasn't crying in a dramatic way. It was more like my body was leaking stress because it didn't know where else to put it. I drove to a larger lot a few miles away, somewhere I thought I could park without drawing attention, and I spent the afternoon inside the car making lists I couldn't afford to complete. find a job, find a room, find a way to get money fast without doing something that would haunt me. My phone battery was low from all the calls I'd made, and I kept dimming the screen to stretch it. Night came early in the way it always does, when you're watching the clock instead of living your life. I locked the doors and tried to sleep sitting up. The air inside the car went stale. Every sound outside felt too close. The seatbelt buckle dug into my hip whenever I shifted. I watched headlights sweep across the windshield and flinched each time because I didn't know what I would say if someone tapped on the glass and asked what I was doing. By morning, my neck hurt, my mouth tasted like old coffee, and my nerves felt raw. I drove back toward the same area out of habit, like routine could protect me. I pulled into a different lot and told myself I'd use the bathroom somewhere, wash my face, look human again. I left the car for less than 10 minutes. When I came back, it was gone. For a second, I just stood there, blank, staring at the strip of asphalt where it had been, waiting for my brain to catch up. Then I saw the posted sign about towing restrictions and permits, the small print nobody reads until it ruins their day. I checked the corners of the lot like maybe I'd parked in a different row. I hadn't. I called the number on the sign with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. A bored voice confirmed it had been towed. There was a fee to release it, plus daily storage. The number he quoted was more than I had available, and he said it like it was an ordinary fact, not the final punch to someone already on the ground. I asked what I was supposed to do. He gave me instructions, not sympathy. I stood on the sidewalk with my phone pressed to my ear, listening to directions to the impound office, and the world narrowed down to the simplest truth. The one place I'd managed to turn into shelter had just been taken from me. My trunk wasn't just packed with stuff. It was packed with the things I couldn't replace quickly, and now it was locked behind a gate I couldn't afford to open. I ended the call and looked around, trying to decide which direction mattered. Cars passed. People went about their Saturday errands. Nobody knew my life had been emptied out in less than 48 hours. I started walking because standing still felt worse, and because I didn't have anything else left that could move. A couple miles later, my feet carried me into the one place that didn't ask questions as long as you looked like you belonged. It was a grocery store I'd been to 100 times. Near the front entrance, beside the bakery, there was a small coffee counter with a few tables. It wasn't cozy, but it had Wi-Fi, outlets, and a bathroom. That was enough. I bought the cheapest thing on the menu, a small drip coffee, and took a seat where I could keep my back to the wall. My phone was barely alive. I plugged it in and watched the battery crawl upward, trying to ignore the fact that my car, my clothes, and most of my life were sitting behind a locked gate I couldn't afford to open. Around me, people moved with purpose. A cashier called for backup at the registers. Someone laughed near the floral section. The normalness of it made me feel even more out of place, like my week had slipped off the rails and everyone else was still following the track. When my phone had enough charge, I checked my account again. The number didn't change. I did the math anyway, because panic loves repetition. Then a notification appeared from the family group chat. I tapped it without thinking. Photos loaded, plans, a weekend getaway, a hotel lobby shot, restaurant pics, the kind of chatter that says everyone is fine and expects you to be fine too. I scrolled until my thumb went numb. No one asked where I was sleeping. No one asked if I'd eaten. No one asked anything. I put the phone down and stared at the coffee cup like it could give me an answer. What I felt wasn't sadness. It was clarity. They hadn't just refused to help. They had decided my discomfort was useful. I opened my notes app and forced myself into problem-solving mode. Shelter, transportation, income, paperwork. The last word looked strange on the screen, but it wouldn't leave my mind, because there was one fact my family treated like it didn't exist. My grandmother had owned the house my parents lived in. When she got sick, I was the one who showed up consistently. Not with grand gestures, just with time. I drove her to appointments. I picked up prescriptions. I sat with her when the house felt too quiet. The rest of the family was busy, and I filled the gap because someone had to. After she passed, her estate was handled by an attorney. I knew what her will said. I knew what my name meant on those documents. I also knew my parents had been living comfortably in that house for years as if it had always been theirs. I had stayed quiet because I told myself it was the decent thing to do. I didn't want to turn grief into a fight. I didn't want to be the person who talked about ownership at the dinner table. So I let the silence stand, and I paid what needed to be paid, thinking appreciation would show up eventually. Sitting in that grocery store coffee corner, I finally admitted the obvious. Silence doesn't earn respect from people who feel entitled, it just gives them room. I found the attorney's contact and stared at it until my pulse slowed. His name was Michael Hargrove. I hadn't called him in years. Calling him now meant I was done pretending my family would treat me fairly on their own. I stepped outside near the cart return so I wouldn't be surrounded by shoppers. The air smelled like wet pavement. I hit call. When Michael answered, I identified myself and kept it tight. I told him I'd lost my job. I told him my lease had been pushed into an early termination with $500. I told him I'd been locked out before I could finish packing. I told him my car had been towed with my belongings inside it. Then I asked him one question. What can I do? And how fast can it start? He asked a few clarifying details, steady and practical, like he was already sorting my mess into steps. Then he confirmed what I needed to hear. The house was mine. It had been mine since the estate closed. My parents were there because I allowed it, not because they had any legal right. He outlined the process in plain terms, notices and timelines. Nothing dramatic, just paperwork that moves when it's filed correctly. He didn't push me, he didn't preach, he just made the options real. I listened, and the guilt I'd been carrying finally started to feel less like love and more like conditioning. I told him to begin. A little later, my phone turned into a siren. My sister called first, then again, then again. The kind of persistence that isn't concern, it's panic. After that came my dad, then my mom, then all of them in different orders, as if rotating would eventually make me pick up. I left the calls unanswered and watched the screen light up and go dark. Michael sent a short message confirming he had prepared the first notice and would have it served correctly. No drama, just a clean next step. I stayed at the grocery store cafe because it was functional. Wi-Fi, an outlet, a bathroom, people minding their own business. I bought another small coffee and kept my eyes on the front windows. One car pulled in and stopped, then another, then a third. I recognized the way they parked, too close to the entrance like they were trying to shorten the walk and widen the impact. They came in together and scanned the seating area like they were searching for proof I still existed. My dad spotted me and moved first. My mom followed, already shaken. My sister came last, shoulders stiff, face tight. Not at all the person who had sounded amused on the phone. I didn't stand. I stayed where I was and let them crowd the table. They started talking over each other, trying to force a conversation into the shape they wanted. My dad's tone was controlled but sharp. My mom sounded like she was trying to cry quietly. My sister kept looking at my phone, like it was the weapon she couldn't take away. I waited until there was a pause and asked one question. How did you find me? Nobody answered cleanly. They didn't need to. They had been calling nonstop. And when I didn't respond, they went looking in the places I used to go when I needed Wi-Fi and space. It wasn't love. It was containment. My dad finally asked what I had done. His hands were shaking, and he hated that I could see it. I told them I had spoken to Michael Hargrove about my grandmother's estate. That sentence landed like a weight. My dad went still. My mom blinked hard like she was trying to rewind. My sister's confidence collapsed into calculation. My dad tried to move the discussion outside, somewhere private. I said no. He asked what I wanted. like we were negotiating terms instead of addressing what they had started. I kept it simple. I wanted my belongings back, not when it's convenient, but soon enough that my essentials didn't get ruined or tossed. I wanted my car situation handled in a way that didn't require money I didn't have, which meant someone in this family needed to undo the mess they helped create. And I wanted them to prepare to leave the house they were living in, because it was mine. My mom gripped the edge of the chair. My dad's jaw tightened. My sister looked offended, as if ownership was an attitude problem. They each tried a different angle. Tough love, a mistake, helping. Different words, same intent. Get me to back down, get me to sign something, get me to accept that they could rearrange my life and call it guidance. I didn't argue. I told them the only fact that mattered. My sister paid $500 to accelerate my eviction, and the two of them supported it. A store employee passed by and glanced at our table. My dad lowered his voice and shifted into negotiation mode, asking if I could pause whatever was in motion, promising support if I would just stop. I told him I wasn't interested in promises that appeared only after I had leverage. My mom started talking about family. I let her finish, then asked her what she thought would happen when you push your daughter out right after she loses her job. She couldn't answer. My sister finally asked the question she had been avoiding. Did I really own the house? I said yes. Her face drained. My dad stared at the tabletop. My mom looked between us with a new kind of shock. I stood up, picked up my bag, and told them they needed to start making plans that didn't involve me absorbing the damage. Then I walked away toward the aisles, leaving them at the table with nothing to control but their own panic. Over the next week, my family didn't calm down. They escalated. My dad stopped calling like a parent and started calling like someone trying to manage a problem. My mom left long voicemails that sounded gentle until you caught the message underneath. If I cooperated, things could go back to normal. My sister bounced between anger and fake warmth, as if the right tone would unlock me. Michael kept me on rails. He told me what paperwork would be delivered, what timelines mattered, and what not to say on recorded lines. Once the notice was in motion, my dad's panic sharpened. He asked to meet privately. I refused. I agreed to a public place with cameras and people around. He arrived talking fast, trying to frame what they'd done as discipline, not cruelty. He called it tough love. He used the word love like it was a shield. I didn't debate the philosophy. I told him the practical truth. I had been pushed out with a deadline I couldn't meet. My belongings were scattered, and my car was locked behind an impound gate I couldn't afford. He tried to pivot into negotiation. What would it take for me to stop? I told him I wanted my property treated like property, and I wanted my name untangled from his debt. Years ago, when he expanded his consulting work, he had asked me to co-sign a business loan. I was barely out of my teens. He called it a formality. I signed because I trusted him, and because refusing him in that house always had consequences. Michael had explained what the bank paperwork meant. The loan still had a balance in the neighborhood of $40,000. If it went bad, my credit would bleed with his. I told my dad I wanted off it, either through refinancing or repayment, and I wasn't accepting another vague promise. He said it couldn't happen quickly. He said banks didn't move that fast. He said I didn't understand business. I told him I understood enough to know he had used me. The next call came from someone outside the family. A man introduced himself as Ethan Caldwell, my dad's business partner. He asked to meet and talk through options. I picked a small diner near a busy shopping plaza. Ethan didn't waste time. He said my demand would create a crisis for the company. He talked about contracts, payroll, and people depending on stability, then tried to make it feel like my responsibility. I asked if he knew my sister had paid money to get me removed from my apartment within 2 days. He said he did, then dismissed it as family conflict, separate from business reality. My name on that loan had been business reality when my dad needed it. Now they wanted it treated like a favor. I told Ethan my co-signature was not a favor. It was risk, and I was done carrying it. He asked if there was a number that would make me back off. I told him the number was whatever it took to remove my name cleanly, and until that happened, the process would keep moving. He left looking irritated, like I had failed a test I didn't agree to take. My mom tried next. She asked to meet, and I chose a crowded cafe inside a grocery store because it was familiar and public. She arrived with puffy eyes and a careful voice. She apologized without actually owning anything. She said they were scared for me. She said they never thought it would get this bad. I asked her what she thought an early termination and a lock change would do. She offered a deal. If I dropped the notice, they would help me job hunt, connect me with better opportunities, and support me while I got back on my feet. It sounded generous until you heard the condition. Give up leverage first, then accept their control again. I told her I wasn't a project. She accused me of punishing the whole family and warned me I was breaking something that couldn't be repaired. She expected that to scare me into compliance, and it almost worked. Not because I wanted them back, but because I finally understood what they valued. They valued the version of me that stayed quiet. After that, my sister started sending messages that rewrote history, framing herself as the reasonable one. I didn't answer any of it. Near the end of that stretch, my dad's texts turned frantic. He wrote about the bank, a review, and paperwork issues tied to the house, like the ground was shifting beneath him and I was supposed to stabilize it. I read the messages, put the phone down, and let the consequences keep moving forward, exactly as filed. A few days later, the calendar stopped feeling theoretical. The notice did what notices do. It put a deadline on denial. Michael kept everything clean and properly served, and my dad learned the hard way that paperwork doesn't pause for family meetings. I kept moving like someone who still had to survive. I applied for jobs from library computers, kept my voice steady in interviews, and tried not to think about how most of my clothes were still locked in my car at the impound lot. Michael sent a formal request to the lot asking for a brief hold on any auction timeline while I arranged retrieval. It wasn't guaranteed, but it bought time. Ethan called again near the end of the month. He didn't try to lecture me about loyalty this time. He said the bank had gotten nervous once the loan demand hit their system, and their biggest client was asking questions. He wanted a settlement that removed my name from the business loan fast. Michael negotiated directly. I didn't sit across from anyone and trade feelings. The offer that landed in writing was $30,000 as a settlement to release my portion of the co-signer obligation and remove my name from the loan going forward. It was clean, immediate, and enforceable. I accepted. When the money hit my account, I didn't celebrate. I went straight to the impound lot, paid the fees, and got my car back before it could become another permanent loss. I opened the trunk and touched my own things like they were proof I hadn't imagined the last 2 weeks. Then I paid off the small financial damage that had piled up during the chaos and set aside a chunk as an emergency fund, because I never wanted to be that exposed again. My parents moved out on the deadline. There wasn't a heartfelt goodbye. There wasn't a moment where everyone suddenly understood. They packed, they loaded a truck, and they left for an apartment they could afford. My dad's business didn't collapse overnight, but it took real hits. Strained cash flow, shaken clients, and the kind of stress that doesn't disappear just because you want it to. My sister took hits too, just in a different way. That $500 she'd tossed at my landlord wasn't spare cash. It had gone on a card. And once the family's money got tight, her funny idea turned into real payments she couldn't dodge. She tried to blame me for the fallout, but blame doesn't lower an interest rate or repair a relationship you burned for entertainment. My mom tried one last time to pull me back into the old pattern. She asked what would make things right. I told her the honest answer. Nothing could put us back where we were, because the version of family they wanted required me to accept mistreatment without consequences. That was over. I changed the locks the first day the house was empty, set up mail forwarding, put cameras on the doors, and froze my credit with all 3 bureaus. Not because I was paranoid, but because I had learned what entitlement looks like when it gets desperate. My dad sent a text later that night listing how hard things were for them, like struggle was a coupon that erased what they had done. I read it once and didn't respond. I blocked numbers one by one, including my sister's. I told Michael that any future contact would go through his office. A week later, I started a new job. It wasn't a miracle, it was stability. I bought basic furniture, replaced what was damaged, and kept my budget tight. The house felt quiet, but it also felt safe, and that mattered more than nostalgia. Here's what I took from all of it, and what I hope you take too. People will call you selfish the moment you stop being convenient. They will label your boundaries as cruelty when those boundaries block their access. If someone can harm you and still expect your loyalty, they don't want a relationship, they want a supply line. Family can be a source of strength, but shared DNA is not a lifetime contract. Respect is the contract. If respect isn't there, you are allowed to choose distance, even when it hurts, even when other people don't understand. If you're in the middle of something similar, protect the practical pieces first. Know what's in your name. Read what you sign. Keep copies. Build a small emergency fund if you can, because survival gets expensive fast. And if you need to set a boundary, set it clearly, then protect it. Thanks for staying with my story. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, leave a comment with what helped you and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.